Today we're going to be looking at one of the greatest attacking games of all time. This game was played in 2015 between Wesley So, who played as white, and Hikaru Nakamura, who played as black. Wesley opens up the game with d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and bishop g7. This is the mainline King's Indian defense, which Hikaru plays a ton. And Wesley takes the center with e4. Now, in the King's Indian, white usually gets the center, as you can see with the c4, d4, and e4 moves. However, black will usually play d6 and try and strike with e5 or c5 and castle early and possibly use the flanks on the king side and queen side to take some space. We see d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2, e5, and castles. Now note, in this position, this is not actually a free pawn, because if you take, black just takes back, and once you trade queens and take the free pawn, there is knight takes e4 here, and if you take back, your knight is not hanging, and this is favorable for black. Black gets the pawn back and has this dominating bishop. You can't move this pawn, this bishop is sort of stuck, this bishop isn't doing anything, and you haven't even castled yet, so this isn't that good for white, and it's usually better for black. So after e5, Wesley just castles, knight c6, and d5. Now, one thing about playing this d5 move is it commits to locking down the center of the board. You can see that these pawns aren't really going to move anywhere. White can play c5 in the future, however, black really won't even take, and it's still shut down. This pawn can't move, this pawn can't move, and they probably won't move for the rest of the game. And now that the center is shut down, Hikaru will maneuver the knight, try and play f5 and a6, b5, and play on both of the flanks. And that's exactly what he does. Knight to e7. And here, I mentioned that black is going to try and play on both of the flanks, and these are both options. However, in general, I would say that black should commit to one side of the board. For example, you can start with a6, b5, and try and play on the queen side with something like bishop d7 or bishop e6, and then open up the queen with c6. Or you could play on the king side with h5, and then maneuver the knight and play f5, and really go aggressive. And Hikaru chooses the latter. He tries to go for this knight maneuver and play f5 and really open up the king side. There's a reason why this is called the King's Indian attack. Black is going to be very, very aggressive on the king side and use the f, g, and h pawns and start generating a big pawn storm later in the game, which we see. And Wesley anticipates this and plays knight to e1 to try and play f3 and keep the f file closed. However, Hikaru just continues with his plan, maneuvers the knight back, and now f5 is on the way. And while Wesley plays f3, f5 is still a good move because you can just take and the f file is now open. And additionally, a couple of other things that is good about black's position is this diagonal is weak, and the dark squares in general are very weak. This square is undefended. f4 is a good square, and while it is covered by the bishop, it is covered by only the bishop. So you could use it as a good square, possibly for a knight to come in here, or you can trade off the dark squared bishops and bring your queen in later on in the game. Another big weak square is g5. g3 is also kind of weak, so these dark squares are going to be important because we can see that white has put all the pawns on light squares, thus weakening the dark squares. So this is a big commitment. So what does Wesley do? He shores up the dark squares. This dark squared bishop is very, very important. You cannot trade it. And it covers this diagonal, and Wesley will probably drop the bishop back, try and maybe reroute it to g3 to hold some of these important squares, or just keep it here on f2, just to safeguard the h4, g5, and f4, and hold back any future attacks. However, this just allows f4. And while this might look counterintuitive at first, because wouldn't you want to keep the position open if you're trying to attack? Well, after bishop to f2, now there's g5. g4 is coming, h5 and h4. And essentially what you've said is, I'm going to use this pawn to open up the f file, and this this closing of the structure momentarily isn't really going to last, and I'm going to open up the position anyway. Wesley, on the other hand, is going to try and use the time that he has to push this way. And time is a very important factor whether you're attacking or defending. And that is because one or two moves can change the result of the game. Every single move is important. So if you waste a move by playing like Rook B1, whereas you could straight up go B4 and A4, well, that could make the difference because Hikaru only needs a couple more moves, H5, H4, H3, and White is in big trouble. Whereas on the other hand, Wesley only needs a couple of moves, something like B4, Knight B5 with pressure here, and Hikaru is going to be in trouble on the queen side. So time is a very, very important aspect when you're attacking or defending. However, Wesley pretty much just ignores what I said and plays knight to d3, which isn't a particularly good move. It's fine, but it does waste time. The knight was originally on f3. It went to e1 and d3, and while this helps control the square on c5 with the bishop and the knight, well, Hikaru's knight here is not going to go to c5. It's going to go to f6, and g4 is coming. I believe Wesley misinterpreted where this knight is going to go. Thought it would go to this nice outpost on c5, which is a nice square. However, like I said, Hikaru's play is on the king side, so it's most likely going to come to knight to f6, meaning this move here, this whole maneuver, is probably not that good. And while this also controls this b4 square, it's not really important. On the other hand, I would say that from f3, maneuvering it to d2 and b3 so that it controls this square is a little bit more important, and that would have been slightly more accurate for Wesley. And Hikaru immediately just starts. Hikaru is not wasting any time with this attack, and while Wesley's pushing with c5, it doesn't do anything. Hikaru ignores it. Knight f6. Like I said, this knight, it's not going to the queen side. And like I mentioned, this queenside play with the c file isn't doing anything. And while Wesley plays rook c1, nothing's happening. You take here, black just takes back. And the center's closed, the queenside isn't going anywhere. You can play knight b5, but this pawn here is easily guarded in the future. And Hikaru plays a really, really good move. Rook f7. Now, it might look a little bit strange at first, but like I mentioned, this 7th rank here, especially the c7 square, is very important. There's another hidden idea here, which is to play queen f8, which we'll see later on in the game, and really push down the f file. This is very important for Hikaru's attack. And for attacks in general, you need to consider this whole idea of files, especially the f file in general, because when you castle, the rooks line up on the f file. And in general, files are important when you're attacking because they can dictate where you want your play. For example, in general, h2 is probably going to be a weak square. And in some cases, in some other games, you might see that black will attack along the h file and vice versa for white. The g file is also very important because when you castle, you weaken a lot of these squares, and the f file, g file, and h files can be easily opened and attacked. So that's something that's very, very important to keep in mind. And in general, I would say that it's probably favorable in this game for black, simply because while computer says it's slightly good for white, I'd say even the smallest inaccuracy is probably going to result in a terrible position for white, simply because there's no counterplay. It's black, which has all the play. And white just plays king h1. And things are not really looking good. King h1, believe it or not, is a pretty good move. If you're a beginner, you probably won't realize why white actually plays this. However, I think king h1 is a pretty good move. Anticipating the opening with g4 and just sliding king over, maybe you want to play rook g1. And this is a very common a very common idea for counteracting attacks, is pretty much just to cocoon all your pieces. These two bishops, possibly this knight, and maybe even this knight, with the rook, and just cocoon the king, surrounded by pieces, and just shut down any sort of play. This is a very common idea. However, I think white is just too slow, because if you want to cocoon, you're going to play something like bishop to g1, slide the rook over to bring the other bishop back, and then bring this knight in. However, that's quite a few moves. That's like 4 or 5 moves. And Hikaru just goes in h5, h4, h3, g4, and things are opening up. Not looking good for white. And while white plays captures, Hikaru just captures back. And Wesley So has no counterplay whatsoever. Even after knight b5, there is nothing. We can see the power of this rook f7 move, guarding this important c7 square. And rook c7 nor knight c7 is a move here. And it's going to take quite a while for Wesley to create counterplay because while there's pressure here, Hikaru just plays a6, the knight jumps back in b5, and there is no counterplay whatsoever. You're going to have to use this knight to go to b4 and c6. However, it's simply too slow. And Wesley wastes another move too with rook to c6, which doesn't really have any threat. Hikaru just plays g4. And things are really not looking good. g3 even is a move, h4, h3. Maybe just even capturing to play h4, h3 and weakening the g file, f file. Things are not looking good. I mentioned how important time is when you're trying to generate an attack or defend against an attack. In games like this, which aren't very maneuverable or positional, well, time is of the utmost importance, all too literally, because Wesley is wasting so much time, and as a result, he doesn't generate any play. Hikaru, on the other hand, was prompt, pushed all the pawns, and things are really not looking good. Again, computer says the position is still like decent for white because there's long-term counterplay. However, that's the computer. The computer assumes you play everything perfectly to 3600 level standards. Again, a computer is very different from a human in terms of chess. And it's not a good position for white simply because if you play anything slightly inaccurately, it's game over. And Wesley just continues with queen c2, and it's gone. Now, one thing I'd like to include right here is that it's very important to have a plan when you're attacking, especially. Not necessarily for defending, however, it is pretty important then too, just in general for the middle game. But it is very important when you're attacking. Having a plan, which is typically generated off of like 3 or 4 moves, is very important. And in general, Hikaru's plan here is going to play h4, h3. Maybe capture first, then play h4, h3. And if you're having trouble generating a plan while attacking, for example, if you are playing black in this position, you know the position's winning. But right now, there isn't a very clear knockout blow, as in you can't win material, obviously, nor can you checkmate in any obvious ways, right? Well, this is where creating a plan comes to handy, and it might be hard. However, if you're attacking and you need a plan, I'd recommend just see which of the pieces are not in play. These two knights are very good. This bishop will open up, and while it is pretty far from the king, there's this long diagonal. This rook is active along the f-file. This bishop is the only piece that's not in play, and I'd recommend, if you're struggling to find a plan, look for pieces like this, which aren't doing much, and try and maneuver them into the game. Just in general, closer to the king, maybe along a big diagonal, something like that, especially for bishops. They like open positions, so you maybe want to trade, then bring the bishop in, and then counteract this bishop. It is very important that you consider which of your pieces are in play versus not in play, and based on that, you can make accurate trades and then have a completely winning position, right? And Hikaru, part of his plan is to play queen f8, which I mentioned earlier with this whole earlier, Hikaru had a rook here, played rook f7, now to play queen f8 with tons of pressure along here. And g3 is actually a move, because if you take, then the f-file is just completely open, and this battery will be completely devastating. And while Wesley just plays rook c1, and there isn't much here. You're pressuring this bishop, but bishop d7, and now your rook is under attack, making matters worse. And while you play rook c7, this bishop isn't hanging because it's defended by the rook and the knight. And you have no play along the c file. Rook c8 isn't even a move. This pawn is defended, and there's nothing. The only thing you can do is maybe knight b4, knight c6, but even that doesn't generate any play whatsoever. And Hikaru goes with my plan, exactly as I said. Bring in the bishop, the only piece that isn't active. And after bishop to e1, which looks to divert the bishop this way, h4, and it's just lost. The game continued with captures, f3, and takes. Obviously now the bishop is open against this rook. However, Wesley says, I don't care, you can win the exchange because I've won 2 pawns. But Hikaru goes with a knockout blow, knight takes e4. Now, like I mentioned, some of you might know you have a completely winning position. This happens to me all the time. You have a winning position, but you don't know where the checkmate is. You're like, there's a checkmate somewhere here, but I can't find it. Well, sometimes there simply isn't just a win, and it's just equal. But in most scenarios, there is some sort of positional improvement that you can do. But when you're attacking, and generally when you have a really good position like this, you try and sacrifice. Your position is so good, these pieces are so inactive here, you can sacrifice and still be good. And something like this is pretty logical, right? Because if you take back, you open up the f file and you're getting mated. Just straight up, you're getting mated. There's probably a forced mate if you capture, or if it's just completely dead lost. And another important thing is you don't want to get greedy and trade. This rook is terrible. I'll be completely honest, it's completely terrible. This bishop is dominating. You can come to e3 and get along these really nice squares. Like I mentioned earlier, the dark squares are weak. This dark square bishop is very important, and putting Wesley's dark square bishop here on e1 where it doesn't do anything was a mistake. So you don't want to get greedy and trade, because remember, Wesley has 2 pawns. 2 pawns. And a bishop and 2 pawns for a rook is more or less equal. You can hold it. So remember that. Especially for beginners, do not get greedy and trade prematurely without calculating and seeing if there's anything better, simply because this bishop is just so much better than this rook. And while Wesley plays rook d1, now there is rook takes f3, another brilliant sacrifice. This was what happens when you didn't take the knight, which is the computer's best move. However, rook takes f3, again, another brilliant sacrifice. If you take, the queen comes in, and while the queen, your queen is opened up and can come to g2, it's losing, simply because this bishop will come in, this queen was now open with the f file, this knight, it's dominating, and white is lost. However, now, this bishop here in d7 is hanging because the rook is now not on the 7th rank anymore. And while you can take this, there's rook f1 now. And there's no choice. If you take here, well, this is checkmate. Bishop takes f1, queen takes f1 is checkmate. So you have to play king g2, and look at how awkward this position is. You can't even take this rook still because it's just so dangerous. Like knight f4, bishop e3, and that is actually what Hikaru plays in the game, bishop e3. And another important thing I'd like to mention is the importance of quiet moves. Quiet moves are generally when you have a really good position, but there isn't a very obvious win, and often you can play quiet moves. Quiet moves is a move without a check or a capture, and this doesn't bring up any visible threats, right? However, it's a simple move improving the bishop because white is known as what is called paralyzed. White is paralyzed in this position. There's nothing you can do. Pretty much none of the pieces can move at all. And you can play quiet moves like this, simple improving moves, simply because your position is so good. And Wesley tries bishop to g3 to put pressure on this rook, but Hikaru just takes. And it's losing because after rook takes f1, there's knight h4. And the king is just being hunted down. And after king h3, which is the only move, Hikaru plays another beautiful quiet move, queen h6. Just look at this. There are many, many checks here. You can play knight g5, which is what many people will play here in this position. There's also knight f2, And in general, you can play tons of moves which have threats to them. And while Queen H6 has a threat, it is not a check. It is not a capture, but a beautiful quiet move. And now, the dominating H file. Remember the importance of files when you're creating an attack. And now it's just game over. Because this king cannot go anywhere. Remember, it is stuck here in the corner. And this H file discovered attack cannot be stopped. King can't go here because of this knight. King can't go here because of this knight. And while Wesley tries with G5, knight takes, King G4. Look how exposed the king is here on G4. Hikaru finds a nice move, knight H to F3, opening up the queen along the H file. And now Queen H3 is a threat. Queen H4 is also a threat. And it's game over. Wesley cannot stop both of these threats. And while he tries with knight to F2, which stops Queen H3, Hikaru just plays Queen H4, which is the other threat. And the king must walk forward to F5. And Hikaru finishes it off with Rook F8, King G6, and Rook F6, which is a beautiful sacrifice. And the only move is to take here. And now there is this new discovered attack. An important thing to note here is that it's never too late to hang checkmate in 1. Queen to C8 is checkmate, so just something to be aware of. And also there are some ideas with like Rook to G6 or Rook to D8. However, Hikaru finishes off nicely. Knight E4, which is a double check with the knight and the queen. King G6 the only move, and Queen G5 finishes it off. Just look at this king. It walked all the way from G1 to G2, H3, G4, and then to F5, all the way up to G6. This is the purest form of a king hunt. A beautiful game by Hikaru. He used the attack so well, creating very, very good plans to improve the positioning of his pieces in the middle game and using the files to open up the lines, as well as sacrificing pieces when necessary to expose the king. And then in the best moments, he used quiet moves to finish it off. That is all I have for you guys today. Thanks for watching.